All right. Well, thanks, Rich. And every time I hear Rich speak, I'm just feel lucky that he's shepherding the school and done such an amazing job. It's just been phenomenal. And thanks again. I have on occasion cheated on Haas and gone to other business schools, and there's nobody as inspiring and as thoughtful about where things are going in the rest of the country that I've seen as Rich is. So, when they first asked me to do this, I came up with a title, and I actually have to look down to see what the title was, because it was Decarbonizing Our Power Supply, Addressing Energy and Growth Challenges in a Carbon-Constrained World. When somebody calls you 4 months ago and asks you to come up with a title, you come up with something like that, and then you start thinking about what you really want to talk about. So it'll have a sprinkling of that, but really I wanted to do a little broader talk, tell a story that involves Haas, and then show some pictures and really tell the story about how we've been constructing out in the desert one of the largest solar power plants in the world in order to address some of the big challenges that we've got around decarbonizing the power supply. So first, let's start with the story of a kid who was loved the outdoors, I actually ski bummed right after college, so I wasn't on the iBanking track that a lot of my friends were. I said, I want to go do different things. I was more focused on the outdoors and doing things like that. I was the least likely person to ever end up in a business school, and the least likely person to have a business school want you to attend. But at some point, and this is something unique about probably Haas and me. So what I did was I went to Africa for a while. I was a whitewater river guide over in Zimbabwe, and started to think a lot more, did a lot of reflection about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and thinking through the big environmental issues that you read about and are very academic. I'd done a master's in environmental planning along the way, and had thought about a lot of climate, carbon change, and other issues. And started to think, well, how do you do something to change this, and how do you actually make this unique, or how do you make your unique impact on this? And I had a professor at UVA in this environmental planning master's who helped me structure a program around creating market-based solutions to environmental problems. And that was really my nexus with how do you think through ways to change the trajectory. It's not about joining a nonprofit and or a law firm and going to sue the big bad corporations. It was more jujitsu. How do you show people the way to make a lot of money in this and do some good along the way? So I started to refocus on that, and then came out. I had several interesting opportunities. I wasn't quite honest. There were a few other schools that wanted me. They were mainly Northeast, and I ended up came out to Haas and I knew it was the only place I wanted to go once I got here. The combination of the first day I got here, you met a group of people that had this entrepreneurial spirit, and there wasn't a lot of that entrepreneurial spirit in the rest of the country. You'd go up into the Boston area and other places, and it was much more focused on things like investment banking or hedge funds and finance, and they didn't have that spirit of how do we build, how to create things. Everybody I met when I came out here just to interview was somebody who wanted to start a company or do a company, and there were people out of the technology space. And if you come from Virginia, that's abnormal. But it was in a good way. And the other thing was they had this asset up the hill that Rich has already mentioned called Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and not a lot. There was no such thing as an energy program anywhere in the country that was associated with a business school. So every business school now has a clean tech path or this. There are hundreds of students in all these different paths. When I came out here, I was the only one in our class who was focused on energy. I had to create my own program. I went up, but I was able to. The school was very flexible and let you work with the scientists. I actually did some work up at the labs all the way through school. And then with Joanne Dunway, we put together a trip to China to go look at joint implementation, which is the way we were originally under. We've been thinking in the U.S. about carbon reduction. It hasn't always been top of mind, but it's been persistent since the early 90s. And this was a U.S. government program to get U.S. investment into China, because China was building a lot of coal plants and still is. And we were looking at and so we sent a group of students over there, and that was my first exposure to the real interesting areas of the world where energy was not the way we think of it here, but it was, it was thought of in terms of massive coal, very dirty, very different. We hide a lot of that here, but and that woke me up even more. So as I left, I joined PG&E, and the original plan was to join. I wanted to go to a utility and learn more on their dollar, but I always knew I wanted to start a business. And the plan was to go for 2 years and then find some smart people and start my own business. And I failed because I lasted 7 months inside PG&E. And I've met some smart people earlier than my plan really wanted me to. And so we left after 7 months. We formed a company called Silicon Energy. We grew it up, and we grew it into a very large demand-side management company. So that it would basically smart thermostats, turning things on and off, but through zeros and ones, and just with computer code and programming, we were able to avoid the construction of about 2 gigawatts of power plants. That's 2 large coal or nuclear facilities that never had to get built because of just what you call demand response or load control, all done with computer software. And we sold that company, and Rich was polite in the way he said that I was, once I sold it, I purposely designed this. He made me sound a lot more thoughtful than I was. The true story, once we sold Silicon Energy, was my wife told me I couldn't work for 6 months. So she counted up all the time that I hadn't taken, growing a company is intense, and you don't take the, we certainly don't get the French 6 weeks of vacation a year. You get 6 days, and so she gave me a number, and she said, we're 6 months, you're not allowed to work. And I said, that's fair. So we went, we took our kids, and we went to Italy for 2 months, and then came back, and she hadn't told me that I couldn't think. So it was a little bit of there was a technicality in there. So I did go up to the labs. They were kind enough to give me a desk, and Mark Levine, who had actually helped us on the International Business Development Project from Haas in '96, runs the energy group, and he gave me a desk and was able to call me a visiting scholar, and I was more of a visitor than a scholar probably, but I was up there and it was a great little sabbatical. You could go talk to very bright people about where the world was headed, and I wasn't, Rich talked about 2080. I started with 2050. 2080 is just too far out for me, so 2050 was my year, and started to look at where does carbon have to be, what do we have to do, and I didn't believe anybody else's math around it, so I just wanted to do my own thinking. And it's a pretty daunting challenge if you actually believe that carbon and climate change are real, and that this is, which I do. I did a lot of work in grad school and just looking at the raw data and the numbers. We've got to get to a very, very small number. About 20% of the power supply can be from a combination of carbon-emitting sources. So natural gas, coal, but people think of natural gas as something that's going to help. We have to get rid of most of that. So you have to get rid of all the coal and half the natural gas plants, and somehow have 80% of your power come from zero carbon-emitting sources between now and 2050. And to help you think about what that is, that's basically 1 gigawatt. A gigawatt's a nuclear facility. Nuclear probably is a big part of what we need to do. It's 1 nuclear facility has to be built in the world every day between now and 2050 to get to those numbers. And we didn't do one yesterday or the day before or the day before that. So we're deficit spending in almost every category in the world, and this is a big one, where if you don't build the equivalent of a nuclear power plant of zero carbon power every day, you're behind. And we're falling farther and farther and farther behind. So I then started to look at, well, how do you do this with a scale that is meaningful or that can have an impact? Because the numbers were really intimidating. And you look at wind, which has intermittency. You had photovoltaic power, which you do every rooftop in the country, and you can solve 10% of the problem. Good thing, we should do it, but there are going to be lots of things we need to do. And the utilities were looking at something where they had to they have this peculiar job where they have to actually keep the lights on all the time. So it's called 5 nines reliability. It's 99.999% reliable. And their big challenge, so I went down from the labs where I was working, spent a lot of time with the utilities and the operators, and they said, you just can't get there with the wind and the photovoltaic power because it's intermittent, and when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, I've still got to have built a gas plant, I've got to have built a nuclear plant, I've got to have built some other asset to back it up. So it's a small part of the solution, but it really doesn't, you can never solve the problem with things that are intermittent. And so then this is where the story gets interesting. I had heard of a group out of Israel who had built so I started to look at solar thermal, which is a way to, it's like a real power plant. You can do most of the power from solar. You can splice natural gas in, so you can combine it with fossil fuels. It can be dependable and reliable. And there were these 9 power plants that had been built in the 1980s by a team from Israel. And it was 90% of the solar energy in the entire world was built by this one company by 1990. And they were fascinating assets. 25 years later, they were performing at 103% of nameplate capacity. And each one of these plants had been built in 11 months or less. And so I said, I just want to go meet these people. These guys were legendary. So I looked all over the world, and it's kind of like in the computer industry. Everybody says, oh, I'm from IBM. IBM sort of incubated a lot. If you walk around the world and look at the solar thermal companies, the company's name was Luz, and everybody would say, I'm for Luz, I'm for Luz. Every new company claimed this heritage to this company called Luz. And it took me a year. I finally found but I was meeting people who I didn't think had the either creativity, intellectual capacity, or execution skills to have done. So there were a lot of false claims to this heritage. And I met a lot of companies. At this point, I'd run out of, my wife had said I could work again, and so I went to Vantage Point, a venture group. And I said, I just need a desk and a very big expense account so that I can fly around and look at and explore this thesis. And so they said, sure, here's don't exceed X, and X was a big enough number where I could actually do some work and bring some engineers in and go look at all this. And so I went around and I looked at all these different companies, and I wasn't meeting the meaty players. I could tell the people who, and some of them were funded by large venture capital groups that come in and poured $100 million into things. Vinod Khosla put money in, but they all went bankrupt because you could tell they just weren't. They hadn't really thought through the problem. They weren't the people who'd executed, but they claimed to be. So finally, I went over. I found the group that had built this. They called themselves Luz 2. It took me a while to figure that one out. And I went to Israel, and when I flew over after a year in the space, I went to Israel, and I thought I was an expert in solar thermal. I'd spent a year of my life doing nothing but focusing on this, and I knew a ton about it. And it was the most humbling week of my life. So I landed as an expert, and after the first day, I realized I was, at a 3rd grade level. That these were the guys who really understood the issues, understood the problem, and I came back and I said, if we can't do something with this one company, stay out of the space. It's not a 10,000 foot, it's not Mount Whitney, this is Mount Everest. It's complicated, it's hard, people are going to screw up, there's a lot more complexity to it, and that turned out to be an accurate statement. So it is we did invest money into that company. And then along the way, they made the mistake of asking me to run it, and that's how we kind of got to the starting line here. So BrightSource, the formation of BrightSource was, we started the company in 2006, and since then we've been on a fascinating path, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. But really, I want to tell the story of BrightSource I hate PowerPoints, but I like pictures. So I think some pictures will help a lot on this, and make sure people understand what we're building, the size and the scale, and then give you a feel for what's going on. Because you can build, we're right now building three largest solar power plants anywhere in the world. They're under construction now, and we have 10 more to build between now and 2016. That's about $12 billion of power plant construction for that one company is executing on. And these are all at a scale that can make a difference. So it's at a scale that can start to do things and can start to actually add up to something that's going to matter. But with that little bit of optimism, I want to footnote that even if we execute on everything that we do, this is the biggest portfolio of solar plants anywhere in the world of any company. And even as we build it out and we execute on it, we're basically doing 1 week's worth of that. So, we're going to do a lot. We're doing a lot of hard work, and we'll get 7 or 8 gigawatts, and that's a week's worth of work. So we need a lot of people that are, knocking down, whether it's nuclear, wind, solar thermal, PV. This is a very complicated, very broad problem, and I think a lot of people are underestimating what the challenge really is. So, and that's just one of my favorite shots of the sun. So that is taken from a satellite that, the sun pumps out 5,000 times the energy that we need every day. And so we don't really have an energy problem. We have a collection and a distribution problem when it comes to solar. You've seen, we don't need to spend too much time on the fact that coal has some challenges and that we need to replace a lot of that. Here's one of the ways we're doing this is we really build these power plants for two purposes. The one I'm showing you here is one that we built for Chevron, actually. And Chevron uses, they burn a lot of natural gas to create steam for what's called enhanced oil recovery. And about 25% of the natural gas burned in California is burned to create steam to shove in the ground to get oil out. I didn't know this until we started to get deeper into work with Chevron. And what we're doing here is we have a large field of mirrors that surround the tower. We're basically putting 400 to 600 suns of concentrated energy up onto that boiler. And we're just boiling water, creating steam. And then that steam, instead of burning natural gas, now they can use solar-generated steam, and they can decarbonize their operations. And it's a big impact. If you look at California, if you take 25% of the natural gas and can start to displace that with solar power, that's a big, meaty impact. That's more than a lot of that would be more than all the rooftop photovoltaic power, just one of these plants of scale that were put in the entire world in 2006. So it's the natural gas and the burning of gas to shove in the ground to get oil out is something that is one of the many areas you can use solar thermal power. The more accessible one and the one that we focus on the most is just regular power production. And so this is a power plant this is a mock-up. This would be a 250 megawatt power plant. So a fourth of a nuclear plant or a fourth of a gigawatt of power. The tower itself is around 500 feet high, 500 to 800 feet high. So taller than any of the buildings in downtown Berkeley and about 3/4 of the Transamerica Pyramid to scale it a little. In fact, our later towers get to be about the same size as the Transamerica Pyramid. You surround them with mirrors, hundreds of thousands of mirrors, so about 100,000 mirrors per 250 megawatt plant, and each mirror is the size of that screen that you're looking at. Each mirror, or heliostat is what we call it, powers a home. So right now we're putting one a minute online out at our project in the Mojave Desert. So we're putting a home online every minute with Bechtel. It's a very efficient way to roll out something at sizable scale. The steam is generated up at the top. It comes down. You turn a turbine. That turbine gives you what is called grid-friendly power. So the utilities have challenges with photovoltaic power and spiky DC power. It's hard to integrate. But if you have a turbine turning, it actually integrates with the grid right at 60 hertz. It's easier for them to back up. It's much friendlier and easier for them to deploy. But most importantly, you'll see at the bottom storage. So, the system peaks at around 4 o'clock, and the sun peaks at around noon. So the ability to store, and that peak is moving out to 5 and 6 and 7 into the later evenings. So storing energy is one of the most important, if you look at 5-9's reliability, keeping the grid running, the ability to store and dispatch is absolutely key. And that's probably the biggest advantage and the reason that people want to build such big amounts of this is a flexible asset that you can store. What we do is the steam, a lot of it goes through the turbine, generates electricity, and then part of that steam goes through a heat exchanger to molten salts. And that salt, you just heat up salt to 550 degrees centigrade, and then you can hold it, and you can then, through a heat exchanger, generate steam whenever you need it. So now I can generate power from the sun at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night, more importantly, 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. That's when they really need it. So that ability to store and dispatch is key. Now I've only built one power plant, which is flexible and has advantages for the utility. Instead of go back to wind or PV, I have to build the intermittent plant, and then I have to build another natural gas plant to back it up. So it's a very attractive and important asset as you look at how to keep the grid running, how to keep things stable, and the power supply running. So, and this is the one graph. I'm not going to overload anybody with graphs. Nobody wants to see a lot. But this one, to me, tells a lot of the story. This is, renewables are complicated, and utilities are not simple things to run. So That's the curve that you see at the top, the smooth one, is the load shape in California over one day. The peak is between 4 and 6, and that's a cloudy day with photovoltaic power, so you've got a spike up and down. That doesn't mean that's not a good thing to do to build those plants, but you have to have built all that area in blue is a backup plant to back it up. So to really get reliable power, people underestimate sometimes what it takes the simplest phrase is just what does it take to keep the lights on, right? You've got to have a lot more than just that intermittent source. And I think that it's easy to absorb little amounts of intermittency in the grid, but a big part of what's going to happen in the next decade or two as we get more and more is this complexity of how do you integrate and how do you keep the lights on. So I mentioned right now we have 13 contracts to build plants, and we're building them in Ivanpah. I don't know if anybody can see the pointer. But everybody knows where Las Vegas is. So 45 miles from Las Vegas, right across the California state line. You pass Whiskey Pete's on the right, and Ivanpah is the power plant that you'll now see from the highway. The next plants we're building are Hidden Hills Ranch. We try to build 2 or 3 power plants at each one of these sites. But each one of these sites is fairly large. So there's Ivanpah before construction. It's a dry lake. There's a golf course. You can see that green area. Seriously. And you can just see Whiskey Pete's and the casinos right in between those 2 white areas. That's Nevada. That's the border of Nevada. So people coming up from LA that just can't quite make it to Las Vegas, stop there. So this site was we looked hard. We went through a lot of efforts to keep. I had a background in environmental planning. We were looking for benign sites with very low impact, and we found one. And then it blew me away what a low impact, well chosen site, how much controversy you could walk into. So here I'd come out of a world where we were trying to think through environmental issues, and I actually started at this from the species and habitat and biodiversity angle, and then some of the large environmental groups were the biggest adversaries. So they were fighting, this and every other solar plant that was over, 10 acres was in some serious skirmishes with the environmental community. And it was a very, very unfortunate and misguided, effort on their part. So I spent a lot of time with the senior teams at the Sierra Club and NRDC and walking through these big issues because if you can't do this, we're toast. It's that simple. I mean, all the species, basically, the Southwest becomes a dust bowl. It's one of the earliest and hardest hit by climate change. And we picked areas that were very, very benign, no endangered species at all, and yet they were still hard to permit. So if you can't get those easy, the sites that should be easy, the rest of them, as we look out, it's going to be very tough. And the biggest one for me is solar is 1/4 of the land of wind in its impact. It's very efficient, and so it uses 1/4 for the same amount of power, 1/4 of the amount of land, and it's 1/40th the amount from biofuels. So solar is the most concentrated and the most land efficient way to do this, and yet it still ran into some big challenges along the way that I'll talk about. So we did get through this, and there's a lot of leadership by 2 people up there was key. Secretary Salazar was absolutely critical in helping think through all these issues, and he actually was very involved in not just ours, but a lot of the solar plants through the Southwest as we looked at how do you have that discussion and how do you make sure that you actually can build things of a size and of a scale that are meaningful and do it in a smart way. And then Arnold Schwarzenegger actually deserves a lot of credit. So he set the tone with that this was important and that it was something that California really needed to do, and he led the way to 33% renewables, and was just actually those 2 men really did a lot, and a lot of things wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for them. And my favorite part of this picture though is we all had suits on out in the desert with ties, and then this woman came up and she said, well, the governor's coming and he doesn't have a tie. So he'd like for all of you to take your ties off. So we we all had to remove our ties so he could come in his snakeskin boots. And so this is a view of the site itself now that we've started construction. And just to scale this and size this a little bit, it's 6 miles from the bottom of that. There are 3 units. You can see the tower at the first starting to form up, tower at the second, tower at the third. 6 miles across. It is 3,500 acres. It's a fairly large site, and this would be the large. Any one of those 3 would be the largest in the world, and in aggregate, it'll be the largest facility anywhere in the world. It'll produce power for around 170,000 homes, and it'll be the smallest thing we ever do. So as we look at our next ones, they get bigger as you move forward. Now there's some numbers that are power related, 377 megawatts, but there's a big number up there. $2.2 billion is what it took to, that's the project financing that's required to finance and make this plant happen. So, and this is an area where everything in energy, and this is a big challenge in the whole clean tech sector, you have a lot of venture capital money came into the sector and didn't understand what it took to build capital-intensive projects. And so it was, capital light, capital efficient models meeting industry that was not and could not be. So the only capital efficient play in all of the energy world is, in a way, what we did 10 years ago, which is using software and systems to make the grid smarter or to turn lights on and off at smarter times. But everything else requires copper and steel and power lines and infrastructure, and it requires, whether it's photovoltaic or wind production or anything else, there's a lot of capital involved. And so that's a long way of saying that the venture guys who came in lost a ton of money not understanding this. There are billions of dollars in funds that have basically evaporated by coming in, not understanding the basic structure, and funding companies that didn't understand the basic structure. And then just, it's been a very, very, and I think ultimately was a very bad outcome, because now, several billion, probably tens of billions of dollars later, everybody's retreating just because they didn't understand how to think it through. But a lot of it comes down to project financing. And that's something that I felt lucky. I had a CFO who was fantastic. He understood the issues. He understood how to do project financings. He had been my CFO at Silicon Energy, and he also, he's a Haas grad from '73, great guy, but he was at Silicon Valley Bank as their CFO, and I called him and I said, Jack, I can't do this business without you. It's hugely capital intensive. I need you to help me here. And he said, absolutely not. I never want to work with you again. Not going to do it. I've done it once, and I really don't, and that's a pretty accurate statement. And so I said, look, I know you don't want to do this. I don't blame you, but there are certain founders' rights when you're starting a company. One is where you put the office. I said, if you were to ever work with me, where would you want the office? Because I want to make your commute easy, and just tell me where you want it. I'll put the office there. So he said, well, I want it close to BART, but I'm still not joining, but I want it. And I knew he had a 2-hour commute every day from Lafayette down to Silicon Valley Bank. So finally, though, I had to call his daughter, who was 18, and said, Lindsay, I just call your dad and ask him one question. Just ask him, Dad, when you finish working, do you want us to remember you as a banker or as somebody who built the largest solar plants in the world? And that's sort of what it takes sometimes. So he called me up the next day and said, "You're an asshole." but I'm in. I'll do it. And so he's with us, and he was a key part of structuring this, putting it together. No way we could have gotten it done, I think, without him and his team and his ability to put a massive financing together. We actually got capital from NRG and Google, and then BrightSource we only own 14-15% of our own power plants. We can't afford to own anymore, so we sell them off and then move on to the next one and gradually accumulate. But we really sell the technology into these projects, and that's where we that's our business model and how we make our money. We did get a DOE loan guarantee for $1.6 billion, and I should make a comment about this because I think it's something that's not understood very well. So the program started 20 years ago, really, for nuclear power plants, and it was designed for what's called project financing. And project financing is where I've sold all my power in a binding 20 or 25-year contract to a credit-worthy utility, and now I can get debt and equity, and I can structure my financing. And so there are a group of projects, ours, GE's, Southern companies doing it for nuclear. Every single project financing under that loan guarantee program is doing really well. The program drifted and started to take risk that it never should have and finance manufacturing and finance business plans, and so it drifted starting in 2005, and then it got exaggerated in 2008, and that's where you got Solyndra. There's a list of 4 or 5 companies that have gone under, gone bankrupt, and every one of them is in that category of where they finance the manufacturing line or finance part of the business model rather than project financing is 99.99%. It has to work because you've got a balance sheet from a Bechtel, you've got the utilities that are, by definition, it's a very low risk, and it's the way the program was designed and the way it should have been run. But it drifted, and now I think the program is probably dead. But this is an example of a good outcome of that program. GE built Shepherd's Flat, which is the largest wind farm in the world, with GE as the equity, and a partner of ours, Caithness, has some equity, and that's another really successful project. Southern Company's building a nuclear plant that's $14 billion under that program. So the program, don't confuse the good stuff with the, don't throw out there's some really misguided stuff, and then there's a very appropriate way to use this money. And I think this and others are good examples of that. But unfortunately, that's academic now. I think the program's just dead. So here's one of our fun, as we found there were species on the site. The desert tortoise, I now know a lot about, it's a threatened, not an endangered species. They live, they're kind of neat animals. They live 80 years or so. We now have a net. We had 38 on the site. That's what we thought. We then found 130. We've moved them all. But we have spent, because of the permitting requirements, over $35 million on moving 138 tortoise. So, and we've had to buy 3 times as much land as we used for the plant to preserve. So if every plant goes through that, it's an interesting challenge over time. And we actually have a program that they call Head Start for tortoise, where we've incubated more than we've lost. But it's an interesting issue, and if you to do it right, it's expensive, and you got to build that into the way you do your plants. We try to use a low-impact construction approach, so this is a lot of the construction on the site. We leave a lot of the vegetation in place, which it actually saved $80 million of civil work, because when you leave the plants, it's amazing what a great job plants do of keeping soil in place. So it's actually been really helpful for us. It was a good strategy. Those are some of the heliostats, and you can see all the vegetation. We just leave it there. This is the common area. So all that was built for the construction of the site, and a lot of that gets taken away at the end. That one building was $50 million, and it's a temporary facility where you have the full manufacturing line in place, you manufacture everything, you take it out, but in a $2.2 billion project, and you take the equipment to the next site or the next plant. There's the tower going up. And the tower has, the boiler at the top of the tower is very similar to what you see inside of a coal-fired power plant. So we use the highest efficiency boilers, and what's interesting is it's like following Intel from the 286 to 386 to Pentium and on. We just follow GE, Alstom, Siemens. They've been constantly increasing the efficiency of turbines. So it used to be 36% efficient. The ones we're using are already 42% efficient, very highly leveraged number. 46% are our very next plants. They're moving to 49%. So there's this great path forward, and you just follow that path, and you can increase efficiency, decrease cost, shrink the size of your plant. And it's leverage. That means I have less steel, less concrete, less labor, a smaller footprint. So it's a very powerful path economically to go forward. I like this picture just because you can actually start to get a feel for the size and the scale when you look at the size of the bolts relative to the guy's shoes. And these are really large plants that are built up 400, 500 feet in the air. The boiler itself is 800 tons up there. And there are only about 5 cranes in the world that can lift these. So it's a very serious construction activity. Bechtel is the lead constructor or contractor behind this and is building a lot of the plant. And right now we have about 1,600 construction trade on site. But we do it. We don't have, BrightSource has 450 people. So we only have 150 in the U.S. The rest, all of our engineering and R&D is over in Israel. But the on-site construction is temporary for about 2 years, 1,600. And then we'll have about 86 permanent jobs. And that's another boiler picture. That's one of you've got to be able to do a heliostat every minute. So think about bringing a home on the grid every minute. What that means, it means you've got to have, one guy, machinery, the ability to put a post in the ground. You've got to be able to hydraulically put it in, move to the next one, have a team come in, put that heliostat on, and it's a constant pace, 500 a day, that you have to construct and move forward. And there's a group of the heliostats that have been finished with construction. And that's probably the latest picture of the field. So now you can see all that. We're only a third of the way through the glass being laid out there. And the tower is basically almost up to the height it'll be. But all this goes online, and you can see it looks like there's quite a bit to go. We are now 6 months from full completion of construction. So the pace is just really picking up, and it's been very impressive watching a company like Bechtel, the way they organize. Everything is just so well executed, so well organized. I'm glad we're not doing it because it's not, it really shows a lot about picking the right partners and knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. Because if we had tried as a company to manage that construction process, I could promise you it'd be nothing but a disaster. I don't think Bechtel's 100 years old. They built everything from the first nuclear plants, the first coal plants, the first gas plants, Hoover Dam. They really understand how to think this through and have done a phenomenal job. And there's a last shot of that's the oil. I like that. It's got a little bit of a juxtaposition of sort of the old world of energy and the new. And there are companies like Chevron that are thinking through a lot of this, how you move forward, how you think about decarbonizing their operations. And they're really trying to now part of it is in California, we push them through things like AB 32 and force them to move forward. But they're really looking at this, and the size and scale. We're looking at one plant in the Middle East for one oil site, and the steam need is the equivalent of 15 Ivanpahs. So Ivanpah was big, one oil field, 15 of them. That's the steam need just to run an oil field, to get all and it's to get the extra oil out. So you get your first level of oil out, and then you have about half the world's oil reserves are kind of that thicker, more viscous oil, and the need is just tremendous. So I want to leave time for questions. If I just to wind this up, I think the world is in a pretty tough spot when you look at what has to get done. We're doing, here you look at a company like BrightSource. We've marched through some very tough stuff to get to where we are. You started the race. There were probably 10 competitors. There are 2 companies left that know what they're doing, that are building plants, and everybody else has either not been able to execute, not done well along the way. So there are 2 in our industry that know what they're doing, that'll keep building. And the 2 companies, we can build, call that a couple of weeks worth of that 7 gigawatts a week demand. In wind, you've got big companies, GE, Siemens, others, but they're still not putting a dent in what you've got to do. So if you look at the total of all fossil-free activity everywhere in the world, all carbon-free, we're at about 10% of the pace that we need to be on to do what you might say, tread water. I don't want to leave on a discouraging note. I want to leave it on a more uplifting one, which is, the fact that you can pull some of this off, do it, attract capital, and that you can start. You got to start before you got to walk before you can run. And we're putting the basics in place between us and other companies to start to increase that path and to increase that curve and to build up. And once you've built 10 of these, and there's no reason you can't build 30 of them and 50 of them, because then you can license it out to others, to lots of contractors like Bechtel can operate in semi-parallel fashion. And you can solve basically for about 3% of the surface area, land surface area of the world, you can run all the energy needs out of just solar thermal. You wouldn't do that, but that just helps size it's possible, you can do it, and we just have to put capital and policy in place to give it the guardrails to let it happen. So with that, thanks, and I'll leave room for questions.
Very impressive. As an individual, how can we get on board from investing in something like this?
Well, the one thing I didn't talk about was so BrightSource has been privately funded, and we've raised about $500 million of private capital. We just went out to see if we could do a public offering, and we went on the road at a very awkward time. So we were out, and we were on the road in the worst 2 weeks of the stock market in the last 6 months. This just happened in March. And but the clean tech and solar sector was 3 times worse than the rest of the market. So it was just the analogy I kind of looked at when I came back was it was sort of like, even if you're Michael Phelps, it's like you're swimming into the Bay of Fundy. And if you just have a bad macro environment where people are not, clean tech and solar are a tough sector right now. So we looked at it, we said we didn't want to price below or in something that wasn't good for our investors and shareholders, and decided just to stay private for another, we don't know. Well, but we'll see. We've got we got supportive shareholders. We got a lot of people. Chevron's one, BP's one, Alstom invested in us. A lot of big energy companies. They get it. They know what we're doing. Okay. But that just means that there's a delay in when anybody, for us, could invest.
And then I have a very technical question.
Yeah.
Where does water come from?
That's a good. So the water comes from well water on site, and we don't use much water. It's been a key part of the design. So a lot of power plants, even fossil plants, use what's called wet cooling. So you have your steam loop, and then you'll see all the steam coming up from a nuclear plant or a coal plant when you drive by them. Right. And it's a massive amount of water that's consumed to cool the steam and to condensate and bring it back in. The steam itself is a closed loop, but we use what's called dry cooling. So dry cooling is more like the fins on a radiator, a lot of metal exposed to the air, and you can cool without using water. So we've minimized the water usage, which was key. It also put 2 of our competitors under, I think, because they used wet cooling. We then showed in the permitting process that dry cooling was the way to go, and so then we provided, as a civic duty, expert testimony about how you could use, why dry cooling was the right technology, and then if you haven't thought it through from the beginning, it's hard to change, and so the plants didn't get permitted, and some things happened that were awkward. But
thank you.
What about costs versus other sources?
What about
cost of electricity versus
So cost, if you stack up electricity, the cheapest is coal, and coal is going to sit there. And even, cost of electricity is one of the most complicated things because everybody plays a shell game with it, right? Everybody likes to, so even coal, a fully depreciated coal plant, produces, 3 to 4 cent power, but a new build coal plant is 7 to 8 cents. And we don't build a new build coal plant today because of the environmental and the permitting issues. So coal is really, if you were to build one, it'd be 7 to 8 cents to build a new one, not because a depreciated one is kind of a meaningless number. But it's not happening. So then natural gas is in that 7, 8, 9 cents. So it competes pretty well with coal right now. It used to be higher. And with natural gas low, it's going to be in that 7 to 8 cent range. natural gas peakers, which only produce 40% of the time. So think about, coal plants producing 24/7. What the most important power are the peaking plants. And to a natural gas peaker, and that's what we compare ourselves to, is going to be anywhere from 12 to 14 cents. And we're basically in that zone with the existing what's called investment tax credit. Without the solar investment tax credit, it's a 30% investment tax credit. You can do the math on it.
Looking at this from the utilities perspective, I do consulting for Southern California Edison and some of the utilities, and as you well know, one of the big issues they deal with is transmission. So I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the expansion of great technology like this, given the fact that there's such a transmission is an issue for utilities in getting this power from locations like where you're putting them into where they're into the utility grid. How do you think that might limit the expansion of technology like this?
Yeah, well, transmission is a massive issue for the utilities to deal with, and there are very little losses. So transmission is more it's the cost of building and the act of building the transmission, just for the rest of the audience. But it's not the losses are minimal. We now LADWP buys coal from Arizona and Colorado and moves it thousands of miles. We've always moved large amounts of power around, so it's not a loss. It's just building the lines. Now, building lines is complicated. So a lot of what we do a lot of, if you're not good at understanding the transmission system, where to connect your plants, how to work that game, then you're not going to build your plants, right? So it's a core competency. Because we have dysfunctional transmission policy, the people who are good at working around it are going to build plants, but it's not an easy. It becomes a strategic advantage if you're good at it, and it becomes a big hindrance if you're not. So we work a lot with the utilities. We work a lot with Edison. Edison's the big one who's building most of it, and you have to make sure all of your. We started early, which is always a good thing in transmission. We're now, if I'm going to build a plant now, I'm already thinking through transmission for 2022, right? So this is how far ahead you have to plan in the utility space. So in 2006, we were thinking through 2013, 14, 15. And glad we were, because if you start thinking of that in 2009, you're done. You can't make those online dates. But you have to plan ahead, you have to think ahead, but the system is not working well, and it's not. They need serious leadership in the transmission area at the Cal ISO and the PUC. But, yeah.
Hi. Go ahead. Yeah. Hi, John.
Sorry, she's been waiting. Oh.
How do you prevent the U.S. losing their reflective quality due to atmospheric pollution?
Yeah. So the question was, how do you prevent the heliostats from losing their reflectiveness due to atmospheric pollution? And we wash them. So it turns out after 20 years in the desert, they don't degrade from sand or anything like that. There's some breakage, and if they break, you replace them. But you do have to wash them it's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. We have every 2 to 4 weeks, you're washing each heliostat, or you start to lose 1 to 2%. So you're washing that whole field and you do it in a low impact way with minimal water, and so a lot of it's all washing. Yeah, I call it semi-automated. There's a machine that goes through, but it's got a driver that has to. We haven't robotized it yet or anything. Yeah.
Hi, John. 2 macro questions. The first is, in 2006, natural gas was probably over $8 per MMBTU, and today it's somewhere about $2. So over the next 3, 4, 5 years, what does that do for clean technology? And the second is, over the next 4 or 5 years, what are the impacts of the upcoming presidential election on clean technology?
2 good questions. So first, natural gas. Remember, natural gas was $2 or $3 back in 1990, 91, 92. So natural gas has these interesting cycles, and nobody knows yet. I don't know myself whether shale gas, what's going to happen environmentally, permitting-wise. So it's sort of an unknown. I'm pretty boring. I invest myself in index funds, and so when I look at natural gas, I just look at the futures market and what the market says. And it basically says gas is $5 to $6 is the futures curve And that's probably where natural gas sits. I just wouldn't bet above or below the futures curve with all the big players. But that's still lower than it used to be. It used to be, the futures curve itself used to be out at 9 and 10. So natural gas has come down. It's got a near-term disconnect down at $2-3, but the utilities who actually have to build plants don't believe that, right? When they look at a natural gas plant, it's going to last 25 years. So they look at what's gas going to cost me over 25 years. And the futures curve goes out to 2020, so they say, well, that'll help me some, and then they have to embed assumptions around it. But it does affect, so just stepping down alone affects. So just the fact that it's down to where it is means that the cost of alternatives or the cost of the competing alternative is down, but also natural gas is not a renewable. So it doesn't, they've got the way, the policy driver, what really drives this right now, since we don't have carbon policy, we don't have a carbon tax, we don't have any way to embed that externality, what really drives it is what's called renewable portfolio standards, and that's it. And it's 33% in California have to be from renewables, 66%, 67% is natural gas and coal, and large hydro and nuclear. So they all compete in one bucket, and then the renewables have to compete against each other. There's some influence on the margin, but really you can't get credit for natural gas in your renewable bucket. So as long as that policy mechanism is in place, I'd say the effect is marginal. But it moves it out further. If natural gas were $10 or $12, then you can compete without subsidy, right? So then you would just be building more of these plants, and you wouldn't need the subsidy. Now the worldwide gas price is $11, $12. So if you look around the world, it's a different, we're sort of unique. But I wouldn't think, I'd encourage anybody who thinks that natural gas is ever $2.50. That's a spot price today. And don't confuse a spot price today with where all the markets think it's going to be. Most people think it's $5, $6, which is a reasonable number. That's the people who are building plants plan it around those numbers. Yeah.
Can you, as you think about building out basically what's a technology portfolio, what kind of productivity enhancements do you expect over the lifespan of it? And do you see yourself going back in and like replacing the glass and replacing the control systems? And is that, what's the upside yield in this sort of a...
So let me answer the second part of your question first. Once we built the plant, it has an owner, it has a contract, it's been financed, and we don't see a lot of retrofit. It's complicated to put a new boiler on or to change it. Maybe at the end of the contract, 20 years later. But we have many generations already of technology improvement, and they're in several. One is increasing size. So we move from 130 megawatts, we double it to 250. That alone cuts your cost 20%. You then increase temperature and pressure, so there's a performance curve. So we're always, if you put the most efficient turbine in, you have a curve that basically performance goes up and cost goes down because I have less heliostats, smaller solar field, I shrink my requirement. And then there's a whole effort inside the company on constantly driving down the dollars per square meter of glass installed. So that's the other. And we've done that already, about 30%. We think we can cut that another 30, 40. I mean, just constantly thinking about it. The engineers hate me when I say this, but in China, we build, each heliostat's around $2,500. In China, you can build a car for $2,500. So there's a long way to go on that curve in terms of just how do you get your dollars per square meter of glass down. We can cut it a lot, and my job is just to keep pushing everybody. But I didn't answer your presidential question, so and it was an interesting one. The way let's not get into who may or may not win, but at the end of the day, right now it's dysfunctional. Right. So right now, nothing's going to happen from an energy policy perspective. Frankly, from what I know, there's a lot more. There's just as much chance with either candidate winning of some stable policy being presented, and possibly more so from the Republican side than from the Democratic side, because we try to talk to Lindsey Graham and some of the Republican senators who are thinking through these issues, and there are a lot of folks on the right-hand side of the aisle who would like to do carbon policy but don't want to do it with a Democrat in the White House. And it's kind of strange. So I don't know. It's something I I would never bet on it, but or any politics. But under Bush, that's when the solar investment tax credits were extended. That's when a lot of things happened, and then somehow things got very polarized recently. And so anything that detunes that would be good, because right now people just want to block the other side too much instead of thinking from the center about how to. But I'd say there's equal interest on both sides of the aisle in the Senate in doing smart policy around renewables, as long as you can phase it out, right? That's the key with the Republicans is how does it not become just an entitlement forever, but how do you have a subsidy that phases out methodically over time? And so we try to work kind of straight down the center since we have no idea how to predict the future. But it's just as likely that you're going to have success with either one in place. But the worst thing is the dysfunctionality that you have now.
Yeah. Hi. You mentioned Solyndra. I actually did a consulting project with Solyndra when I was here at Haas, and it's pretty disappointing. What happened, how it got politicized afterward. So, it seems like your company's been a great success. How come? And Salazar, Secretary of Interior Salazar, was involved. How come you don't think that Obama or the current administration hasn't kind of touted the wins that they've gotten from the DOE program with yours? And another question was why Solyndra failed. Obviously, it was just because the technology was great, but it was just the cheap photovoltaics coming in from China. How is that affecting your business plan? Because I heard a lot more because photovoltaics are getting so cheap. A lot of large-scale photovoltaics are actually becoming quite popular.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I don't know. I don't have a good answer to your first question. I mean, I don't know why the administration and everybody makes political decisions about what to talk about or not to talk about. Frankly, we'd rather just stay out of everything and just go to work. We don't want to be talked about. And half of my PR effort is to stay out of the press as much as possible and just get our job done. But with respect to what happened to Solyndra, they just had a high cost structure relative to what ultimately became the clearing price of Chinese silicon panels. So they and photovoltaics is it's a commoditized business. There's no differentiation from an electron that's produced from a thin film PV versus Chinese silicon PV versus Solyndra, with the cylinders and SIGs. So every time you have a photon, it's turning it into an electron, but if there are clouds there, it's still spiky. It's got all the same issues. And so PV as a category is a fairly commoditized category. And I think if you've got 15-year-old kids in China who can make stuff, which is what, I mean, if you look at some of these places, it's very, very cheap and it is what it is. But it's producing a commodity, I think, that it's tough to live in a commoditized world. One thing I like about what we do is we're the opposite side of it. We have reliable, dispatchable. So a lot of what we sell is that we're not PV, right? We're not even in that category. We are in a category that you can store, you can move around. In fact, there's some great work from National Renewable Energy Labs about how storage and solar thermal can help integrate all those intermittents in. So it's always a portfolio. The utilities always think in terms of a broad portfolio. You don't want one stock. You don't want, you look at the correlations. You look at how much of any one of these assets I can take. But there's a lot of 150 companies in that one category of PV, and there's no differentiation. So that's a tough place to be. Yeah.
So after your discussions with the Sierra Club and other environmental groups, do you foresee a future where they will see Ivanpah as a proof and they'll get on board with this type of solar, or what's the current state?
I think it's gotten. Sorry, the question was after the discussions with Sierra Club and others, do we see a future where they'll actually like Ivanpah and see it as... I think Ivanpah itself had a lot of emotional issues down at the chapter level because of where it was in the desert. So I do think that they are now viewing large-scale solar as something important to think about. They're viewing it as something important to... And we've learned a little too, right? Nobody's perfect. The biggest lesson for me is we thought we engaged in discussions early with them, but it wasn't early enough. And so I think getting out early and engaging with them and, about siting and where you could and should cite and why is important. So I think that their awareness is improving, and the companies that are out there building are starting to get better at communicating. So I think it's getting better, but I don't think they'll ever like that site for some reason. I think there's a lot of, at least the chapters, right? But, yeah.
Hi, I'd like to ask you about the big picture question of all, climate change. And you're welcome to just tell us what you think about the publicity and controversies around climate change. But let me give you a more specific question. Some years ago, there was a United Nations report on climate change and recommendations and so on. Then there was a very famous summary of that report, which got a lot of publicity and controversy. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the recommendations in that report and its summary were fundamentally accurate or not?
So I've been around the science and the data for 20 years, but I wouldn't claim to be the worldwide expert on it. So I'll be very careful about how I've been looking at the information and the data. I had to look at raw data back in the 90s in grad school, and so I've started to, and I think people that look at statistics and really look deep into it, I don't think there's a lot of doubt anywhere I've seen. In fact, one of my favorite professors was one of the big climate change deniers, Pat Michaels at Virginia, and he's now changed his. He's now saying yes, it is. He's gone from it isn't happening to it's. It is, but there's no way you can prove causation to, well, now you can prove causation, but it's uneconomic and you shouldn't do anything about it. So I think that it was unfortunate that people screwed up, and with changing information and changing data, it's probably set just an objective view of things back more than any of us realized. It was really, there are people who say, well, it wasn't a big deal. I think it was stupid. Altering, some of the data and the information and trying to think that you're smarter than the people who are reading it is you should get, disbarred from science for doing something like that. And I think it set everything back because, the data and the information at face value is so overwhelming that there's no, so I guess the broad answer would be yes. I think a lot of the conclusions, the issue's big, the issue's real. It's actually more challenging than I think people realize, and yet, the fact that there was fabrication of data was one of the worst things that the scientific community could have done itself. It's like shooting yourself, not even in the foot. You're shooting yourself. You're shooting your leg off. It was, a few people who did something that was not, not smart, and now it's kind of added a lot of confusion to the discussion that didn't need to be there. Yeah.
I'm afraid.
All right.